Hi there, this is Steve Shaw. I'm supposed to be covering the last segment of the Elder series. My topic is authority. So before I get into that, I actually want to do a quick recap of what Pastor Jesse and Rachel had covered. So Jesse, in his video, he started off by I'll just cover a few of the main points that he covered. Back when Living Faith started, he mentioned that we looked at all the traditions that were set up by church and challenged those traditions as to whether we thought God would want to continue with them or not. He covered the plurality of elders. He covered qualifications of elders, and those are to lead, model, and teach. Another qualification was their elders are to put the church in order. Rachel, in her segment, covered having church, why have church, what are the benefits of attending church. So her first topic was, why do we assemble? And everything that both Jesse and Rachel covered, they gave biblical examples of that. She covered the ecclesia, which is actually the church itself. She covered Lone Ranger Christians. And when I think of Lone Ranger Christians, for some reason, God keeps putting the verse Proverbs 14:2 in my head, which says, "There is a way that seems right to man, but in the end will lead to death." I know that we can get puffed up with pride, especially when we operate without the boundaries or without operating in the context of other church members. Rachel mentioned another verse out of Proverbs, iron sharpens iron. So she was talking about Lone Ranger Christians who don't allow themselves to be counseled or corrected by other Christians and can get off in their doctrine. She also covered the first century church as the perfect model. She covered the topic of sanctification and also submitting to leadership. She mentioned that leadership actually protects the flock and the congregation. And a couple of the last things she ended with were why it's a good idea to be in a church body. And one of those things is it sharpens your relational skills or your people skills. And the last thing I had written down was it builds character. And we all know that building character is crucial and critical in your sanctification process. It is sometimes a painful process. Sometimes there's counseling and correction, but those are things that are meant to be good for us, not detrimental. They're not always fun, but they are for our betterment. So that's it for my recap. So I'll get into a few slides that I put together for the topic of authority. And I'll start with man's definition of authority, which reads, the power to influence or command thought, opinion, or behavior. For example, would be presidential authority. Speaking of the president, I know that we have someone sitting in office right now who, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, we believe that he's setting this country on not a very good course. But just because we may not agree with the policies or everything that they're putting in place, that does not get us off the hook without praying for them. This word says that we're to pray without ceasing. And in those prayers, we should be praying for those set up in authority over us, regardless of whether we like them or we don't like them. I know that some people like to pick and choose which verses out of the Bible that they like. Unfortunately, the Bible is all correct or none of it's correct, and we happen to believe that it's the inspired word of God and that all of it is correct. So the verses that read, pray for your enemies, and I'm not saying the president is your enemy. He should not be your enemy. You're to respect that person's position, regardless of what you think of them, and we should be praying for them. I know I'm deviating a little bit, but I just wanted to cover that. Another one is freedom is granted by the one in authority. A person or persons in command, specifically the government and the local authorities of each state. And like I say, these are man's definition of authority. Another one is a governmental agency or corporation set up to administer a revenue-producing enterprise. A couple of examples of this would be the Transit Authority or the city's housing authority. There were more that I had come across, but I think you get the idea. So for the rest of this, these are going to be slides covering authority from out of the Bible. So to begin with, we have the doctrine of authority, which reads, the right to command and enforce obedience, personal power that commands influence, respect, and confidence. The ancient Jews knew the power of having legitimate authority. And knowing our authority and how to operate in it is extremely important if we want to walk in signs and wonders. If we define our authority, we can have more confidence and boldness while operating within our gifts and abilities. And some Bible verses to back this up. The first is Isaiah 55:11, which reads, so my word will be that which goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty. Some of your versions may say, it will not return to me void, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it. Another Bible verse for this would be Job 38:4-11. And in it, you're likely familiar with this. Job is talking and acting rather pridefully. And in these verses, God is essentially putting Job in his place by asking a question such as, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. So obviously, Job was nor around, nor were any of us, because this happened 6,000 years ago when God was creating the world and speaking it into existence. So it's obviously a rhetorical question because God knew that obviously Job wasn't there. And it's, like I said, it's essentially God putting Job in his place. When we get puffed up and prideful, God certainly has, as sovereign God, the right to put us in our place. It's not a very fun process, but occasionally a necessary one. The next types of authority, or type of authority, would be inanimate authority. So inanimate authority refers to the laws of the universe which are built into creation, which is something I was just talking about. They typically cannot be changed or manipulated and are perfect in nature and are sinless. That is because man has not yet entered the picture. Some examples of this would be gravity, mathematics, sowing and reaping. These are sometimes known as laws. So when you watch or experience a miracle is an action that actually breaks the laws of inanimate authority. So like I say, inanimate authority is imperfect because sin has not entered the picture yet. So another verse that I'm going to read is Romans 13:1. I actually considered this to be one of the main verses on the topic of authority. So it reads, every person is to be in subjection to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. All authority is from God, and we have example after example in this book of God building up authority structures, establishing them, and tearing them down as he sees fit. Like I say, he is a sovereign God, and he knows us no explanation when he does any of those things. So next I'll cover some precepts of authority. I know that there are some folks who think that authority is bad. It's actually just the opposite. Authority is actually a good thing. Authority is actually set up for enhancing freedom and not restricting it. Authority creates freedom by setting boundaries. Freedom is defined by operating within those boundaries, and when you break the law, you suffer consequences. I know that there's been some funny YouTube videos of bill collectors calling people. Obviously, they broke the law, and the bill collector has the authority, has the right to call and demand payment. But this person was saying, I rebuke you, and it's supposed to be a funny video, and it kind of is. But unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, we think as Christians that we have the right to do and say certain things because we don't want to suffer the consequences of breaking the law or operating with outside those boundaries that I just spoke of. Authority defines position, and position defines authority. Power is limited to position and authority. All authority has power. Your power enables authority, and if you don't have the power to enable the authority, then you actually have no authority. There is no authority that is independent from God. Legitimate authority spawns legitimate authority. You actually have no authority if you're not in line with authority. So if you're operating with outside the boundaries of authority, then you are not in line with authority. And lastly, under the precepts of authority, legitimate authority and truth are synonyms. This next section is going to be rebellion to authority. And for this example, this would actually be when David is actually not somewhere he's supposed to be. The kings are supposed to go out when war is taking place. And as a warrior king, David should be leading his army, but he's not. He's on the rooftop. So he's not where he's supposed to be, and happens to see Bathsheba, and we already know the result. I'm sure we're all familiar with this story. Looks upon her, becomes enthralled with her, and as a result, lays with her, has a child, has her husband put to death. I mean, none of this is good. So as a result, Nathan confronts David. God sends Nathan to confront David, and he rebukes him. So 2 Samuel 12:11 says, this is what the Lord says, behold, I'm going to raise up evil against you from your very own household. So this is a pretty severe example of rebellion to authority. Another verse in regards to rebellion to authority is Romans 13:2. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. When a rebel steps out of line with God, you do not have to follow them. A rebel disqualifies himself by his actions. You are to respect position over perfection, and you actually qualify inanimate authority by perfection. If you qualify inanimate authority by perfection, then you are in opposition to God. God is not the author to rebellion to legitimate authority, and he is very efficient at removing illegitimate authority. Like I mentioned, we have example after example within this book. Rebellion to legitimate authority is, at its core, blaspheming the name of God. And a couple of verses regarding this is 1 Timothy 6:1, and the second one is 1 Samuel 15:23, which reads, for rebellion is as reprehensible as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as reprehensible as false religion and idolatry. Lastly, I'm going to cover some lines of authority. There'll just be a couple of these. Supreme authority, which is the authority of God himself. We've covered that in Romans 13:1. God, as the supreme authority, has the right to delegate his authority. Luke 10:22 reads, "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows who the Son is except the Father, and who the Father is except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him." Next, we have what's called delegated authority. An example of this is in 1 Corinthians 15:27 and 28. "For he has put all things in subjection under his feet." But then he says, "All things are put in subjection, and it is evident that he is accepted who put all things in subjection to him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will be subjected to the one who subjected all things to him," that being God, "so that God may be all in all." And the last line of authority is, it reads, "You are responsible for carrying out the plan and vision and desire of the one who delegated that authority to you." The person to whom the authority is delegated can operate in the same function as the one who delegated the authority, and also in the name of that authority. Delegated authority. This is authority that is appointed by the delegating authority. An example of this would be Luke 22:29. "And just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I also grant you." The authority that you operate in cannot exceed that of the appointing authority. Matthew 10:24 is an example of this, which reads, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor is his slave above his master." Please keep in mind that although you may hold the position of delegated authority, it is still a position that is ultimately given to you by God. And a verse for this would be John 3:27. "And John answered him and said, A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven." I know that this hasn't been as long of a video as I hoped it would be. I would hoped it would be 20 minutes to 30, but it is what it is. So in conclusion, I'm going to reread or recover one of the earlier slides. So authority isn't bad, but rather it's just the opposite. It is actually meant to be a good thing. Authority is for enhancing freedom. It is not for restricting it. Authority creates freedom by setting boundaries. Freedom is defined by operating within those boundaries. And when you break the law, there are consequences that you must suffer. By following the law, you will actually experience greater freedom. I believe that willfully living under the authority of God and the structure that he has set up for us will actually help with putting and keeping us in the center of his will. Two things I'd like to close with. The first one being a show that was just put out by Marvel. It's called Loki. Many of you know Loki is the god of mischief, and he's a very prideful man. He considers himself to be a god. And in this episode, he has a run-in with something called the TVA, which is just an acronym for something called the Time Variance Authority. God has just been setting up example after example of authority structures, whether they're fictional like this one is, or they're actually out of the Bible, out of his word. I just want to end with you knowing that authority and authority structures are actually a good thing. And God wouldn't set up something for us if it wasn't meant to be something helpful to us and beneficial to us. The last thing I wanted to cover is I ran across just a one-page segment on the topic of authority, and it's by R.C. Sproul. So if you type in "living under authority," you'll run across this, like I said, this just single-page read. It's a short read, but it's really excellent on covering the topic of authority, and I highly recommend it. that's it for me. So this is last segment. I think we're going to end with taking some Q&A questions. Whether you write them in or however you communicate them, we're looking for any issues or apprehension or anything you have with essentially what we're doing is we're going to be instituting membership at Living Faith. So that's what these video segments and sessions are set up to do. So we'll be moving forward with that here shortly. That's all I have for you. Thank you for your time, and I'll be signing off now. God bless.